Welcome to the Property Management Law Solutions Podcast. Your host, Attorney Tim Baldwin, will guide you in all things property management, law, markets, politics, and commentary. Your property is his priority. Here's your host, Attorney Tim Baldwin.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Property Management Law Solutions Podcast. I am your host, Attorney Tim Baldwin, and we're here for another episode, and we have a special guest with us today, one who I know you're going to want to listen to because the topic we're going to talk about is something that every landlord should be very familiar with and concerned about, and that has to do with mold. So we have Blake Martin on the show with us. Welcome, Blake.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate to be here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate your being here. So, Blake, just so that folks can learn a little bit about you, just introduce yourself and, talk a little bit about your experience and your credentials, and we'll get into talking about some mold situations.
I got you. My name is Blake Martin. I've been doing home inspections. I actually started with my father in early 2010. I was not licensed then, but I was with him every single day of my life. That was the career I decided I wanted to take. I actually got licensed in mold in 2018, both remediator and assessing, and a certified home inspector, if I remember correctly. I want to say like 2015 is when I got certified for that as well. But I've been around construction most of my life, as well as my father. So. And my mold mentor was Mr. Harold Wise, which has got over 40 years in the industry. So I had a very good mentor there to educate me and put me through a lot of scenarios. And even to this day, I still, talk to him occasionally for insight or questions or, just to always stay on top of potential issues or concerns that he may have experienced, to help me on my side.
Nice. Yeah. Mentorship is a great thing. I love having, some of the mentors in my life. Contribute so much into your experience and your education. So I think I'm looking at your website here, which is, I believe it's inspectrealestate.com. Is that right, Blake?
Yes, sir.
So you're you're a certified master inspector.
Yes, sir.
You're a certified home inspector. You have lots of credentials. You have you're ACAC certified. What is ACAC?
So it's an accreditation from an association that, that deals strictly with air quality control and things like that. So, they've got certain criteria you have to follow and a membership you have to fill out in order to be certified. So it's just an additional affiliate, as far as getting certified through that organization.
Okay. And you're a mold you're a mold assessor, and
Yes.
you're a part of various groups and associations. So you've been around, and your credentials are impressive. So I'm going to enjoy this conversation with you because as we're going to just jump right into this discussion having to do with mold. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit for landlords, one of the biggest problems landlords can face is having to deal with mold inside of a rental unit. And so, sometimes that scenario can become dangerous for tenants. And sometimes it's not as dangerous. Sometimes it's not dangerous, I guess, depending on the levels and types of mold we're talking about or fungus that we're talking about. So landlords always have to be aware of this potential problem, the various conditions that could contribute to that problem, and then having to deal with the situation when it does arise, or at least the allegation from a tenant that there's mold in the property. So let's get into this, Blake. I like to just kind of start off with, when you get a property owner who wants you to come in and they want you to assess for mold, like what is the first thing that you're doing when you're going inside that home to begin your inspection?
So normally, I like to try to get information from both sides because it kind of helps kind of pinpoint where the problem could be and what is and what's actually there. Typically if I get landlord calls, I, ask them, well, what's the concern? I want the history of the house. Has it ever been flooded? Has it had roof damage? Like so on and so forth, to try to build somewhat of a history of the house. And then a lot of times, the tenants, obviously when I get there, they're more than, frequently they want to talk about all the issues that's going on. So I can kind of use their information from a separate opinion to try to put my own idea together of what is causing it, or what the issue may be or where it could be, and kind of use that to kind of build a base plan on where we need to sample and so much, so on and so forth as far as the assessment goes.
Right. So your inspection, from my experience, you're looking at both surface, visual surfaces to see if there's potential mold, and then also air quality inside the unit. So let's kind of take it when you're going in, you're just looking around. If a tenant or a landlord says, well, there was a leak in the bathroom, or there was a leak in the kitchen, a faucet leak, let's say, and you're visually inspecting, what are you looking for?
So typically, obviously, visible water damage, usually cabinet bases that are swollen or, something of that nature. And typically, if we find any areas that have any type of discoloration that's even concerning, we use a moisture meter to determine if it's actually still wet, or if, it's just pre-existing or something of that nature. And then we also take relative humidity throughout the unit too, to make sure that there's not an AC concern, as far as humidity goes.
So I guess whenever you're looking at the visual portion of this, what's a sign, or what's a signal to you that there's a certain like surface area that needs to be tested?
So typically, when mold gets to a point where it's colonizing, where it's actually visible, that's usually a pretty good indication that would be a surface sample at that point, because obviously mold from a standpoint is microscopic. So until it becomes colonized and actually grows on the water damaged material, it's hard to really base everything visually. But if you've got a visual issue, then that's where surface sampling would come into play, to be able to compare. Because normally what I try to do is, if I do have visible growth, I do both air quality and physical, so we can kind of compare, okay, the growth that's airborne, is similar in the same kind that's present on the drywall or whatever we're surface sampling. So that way we kind of have a good comparison to where source wise we've, found the source.
Gotcha. So that's, you said a mouthful there. So trying to get to, I guess the point I want to try to get to based on what you're saying. So if you see something that looks visually, from the visual inspection that you want to test, so I'm gathering that you take a sample from the surface. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. We've got different means. I mean, we have a swab sample or a tape lift, depending on what the substrate is we're sampling, determines what kind of sample we actually use.
Okay. And then from there, you're testing the air. So what is the basic process of when you're testing the air?
So normally, and again, every house is different. So until we know like what we're really going into, but typically we pull air quality throughout a house, and inside the AC system as well, to help us determine if maybe one room is just the issue. Because I typically find more issues, if it's an AC issue, it can be throughout, but typically I find more issues in a lot smaller rooms, just because of like either lack of ventilation, or maybe it's a room someone doesn't use that just gets shut up for months on end, that doesn't really have, it has static air coming in and out. So that's where I typically run into that.
Gotcha. So if it's a AC issue, what's sort of the difference between an AC issue versus a isolated room issue?
So with the isolated room issue, again, it's more like a ventilation thing. I tell people it's kind of like the coat closet problem. I tell people they wear a wet trench coat or whatever, they put it in the closet, their coat closet. They probably wear it once a month. If it rains hard enough, well, they put it in there damp, not necessarily wet, but damp, and shut it up. Well, then 3 months later, they open it back up and they've got growth covering all their clothes in the closet. So that's kind of the petri dish effect is what I call it, just because you're putting in a perfect environment, shutting it in a dark, warm place to where growth is going to occur, in that environment.
Yeah, yeah. And then the AC, explain the AC portion of that
Yeah.
as well.
So obviously we live in Florida, so the air conditioning down here is our biggest dehumidifier ever. So when that thing hiccups, or they just get so old after a while, or they just haven't been maintained properly, the coils get clogged, then you start developing humidity issues where the house is not able to remove the excessive humidity. So therefore you get a lot of growth that starts occurring around AC registers and wet areas through the house, bathrooms where the people take the hot showers, it'll start growing on the ceilings, things like that. Because growth is present. I mean, I have to explain to people that you're never going to get a zero reading. I mean, I've done medical centers and things of that nature to where, they run the best filtration that anybody can ever have. And it's like, but to get a zero reading is nearly impossible.
Right. So
So
there's always going to be mold, right? I mean, there's always some sort of
yeah,
fungus.
it's giving it the environment to prosper inside is where that becomes the issue, whether it's water damage or humidity or a malfunctioning AC or, so on and so forth. I mean, I had a customer a bunch of years ago, which it wasn't the customer owned the place, but the people that lived there actually had 22 aquariums in the
Wow.
house. And they created like the worst environment that I've ever seen. I mean,
Yeah.
it literally drew up the walls like something out of a horror movie. Like it was horrendous. And I'm like,
Wow.
and of course they're looking at me like, what do you think caused this? And I literally had to like look back and say, is that a trick question? Like, I mean, it's still pretty obvious at this point, but it is what
Wow.
it is. I get weird ones every now and then.
Wow. So yeah, so let's get into that. So causation obviously is a huge issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience of just being a lawyer for 21 years and dealing with issues like this, there's a variety of situations. Like you're saying, what are the tenants bringing inside the home? Is it aquariums or is it a bunch of plants? Live
Yeah,
plants.
absolutely.
Not running the AC properly the way they should, keeping the doors closed. So talk a little bit about that. What do you most commonly see as sort of the reasons why the mold is becoming a problem in the home?
I mean, one thing that I run to quite a bit, and when I say quite a bit, I mean, for me, it's going to be above average than most people, but a lot of people that are storing furniture for long periods of time in unclimate controlled environments, like furniture, clothing, things like that, especially I've had military that's been overseas for X amount of years and they come back and get all their stuff out of storage. There's a lot of times that, you don't, where it's not stored properly. It's not being climate controlled. So, you start having an issue where you're just in a hot, muggy garage area, in theory, and then you're having to bring that stuff into a home. Well, you don't know if that stuff's going to have growth on it that's visible yet. But like I said, it goes back to they stick it in a dark closet and don't go in until later. And they're like, holy cow, my shoes are covered, my purses are covered. We don't know what the cause of this is. And I've had a lot of situations where it's just been from poor storage situations on contents and things like that. Or I've had situations where if they move to another rental, they may have had an issue there, but if it was airborne and actually on the contents, they've brought it in to the next house. But that's kind of one of those slippery slopes to where it's really hard to pinpoint, this is from the previous house, because obviously I don't know the condition there and things like that. So that's like a rabbit hole as far as going down that, from finding the issue per se.
Gotcha. Are there sort of some telltale signs that when you go into it, and you observe how maybe the tenant's living, such as the AC's on a really high temperature, or
Yes.
the doors are closed a lot?
Yes.
Are there some triggers in your mind that when you look at it, you say, okay, this could possibly be a problem that's been caused by a tenant?
Yeah, so normally, and I kind of have a scenario for houses and condos because I do a lot of condos as well, especially if they're rental condos, like short term, like for summer rentals and things like
Right.
that. When I go into a condo, the first place I usually go to is I check all the AC registers throughout the house, just because a lot of times people they're renting, they don't care. They open up the back doors, the AC's blowing 70 degrees, everything starts sweating like crazy.
Right.
And then as long as they can get the door shut in a relative time, it'll dry back out eventually. But if you have a long-term tenant to where they're doing that, during the summer, like once or twice a week, well, the AC is already struggling enough as it is during that time of year, during the middle of the summer. Now you're adding all the excessive humidity from the water and things like that. So it takes the AC an extra day or two just to kind of balance the unit back out. And the same thing goes for the house too. I walk in and I have situations where it's elderly people and they'll tell me straight up. They're like, we don't run the air conditioner because we're cold, always cold.
Yeah.
And then I walk in there and it's like 78, 80 degrees and the humidity is like 85%. And I'm like, I get you guys are cold, but you can't, like, you have to run the air conditioner at least enough to pull the humidity down within a reasonable range.
Right.
Cause it's only going to progressively get worse from there.
What are the conditions that are best for inside of a unit? Humidity level and temperature. What's ideal?
So ideally, and I mean, this will fluctuate because obviously with all the rain like we've had today, I usually tell people if you can stay in that happy range of say like 50 to 65%, I feel like that's a pretty happy range. Now, give or take, like on rainy days, it's going to fluctuate, 3 to 5% just because of humidity being increased outside, because our houses pull in a lot more moisture than people realize as far as that goes.
Yeah. Yeah. So about 50%, 60% for humidity. And then what about temperature?
So temperature, so that's what's kind of crazy. So temperature is not as crucial as humidity. So
Okay.
even if it's say it's 80 degrees inside the house, as long as that humidity is in that range of say 50, 55, I wouldn't be too concerned as far as a mold issue progressing at that point, because it obviously needs the humidity to be able to grow and prosper and spread more rapidly, because that would be a moisture source for it. But
Yeah.
ideally, I mean, people don't like to hear this, but I try to say below 74 degrees, especially during the summer. Now, in some instances, if you're talking about like a concrete structure like a condo, then you could probably go to 76 and you'd be fine, just because they're a lot more efficient inside than say a stick built house, with typical insulation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So really, I guess, of course, most houses, in Florida obviously have AC, so you
Mhm.
have your thermostat, so you can kind of see where the temperature is inside the house, although that may not reflect accurately throughout the
Yeah.
house, right? Because if it's a large house or even not so large, I guess.
Well,
Uh,
and positioning of that thermostat is important too, because if you've got it directly beside the unit, I've had systems where it'll pull the temperature down real quick, but the thermostat being within 2 feet of the unit doesn't really give it a chance to really run long enough through the house. So
oh, that's
that's
good.
the issue I run into too.
Yeah, I have not thought about that, but yeah, if it's so if it's by the unit, obviously it's gonna be more efficient right there, and so that thermostat is not going to accurately reflect, say, what's going on the other side of the house.
Yeah, exactly. It's no different than, like, I do a lot of houses, especially older homes that are split floor plan where it's 2 stories. They'll have like the unit upstairs and the thermostat downstairs. So it's like the downstairs is usually like an ice box, and
Right.
upstairs is muggy, because I always tell people, if you're able to, having the thermostat upstairs is a little more efficient, just because you're going to be pulling from the hottest area of the house. Now, with that being said, the downstairs is still going to be the coldest part of the house, because obviously cold
Yep.
sinks and heat rises. So
Yep.
that, but that's an efficiency thing that I've seen on several houses over the years,
Wow.
especially old homes.
So here's a good opportunity, I guess, to give the listeners, especially landlords, but tenants as well, if they're listening, is what are some things that a landlord could do inside the home to help gauge, the conditions inside the home.
So I can say now, with what I'm seeing here pretty regularly, especially in condos now, is that a lot of AC companies now, which they do have multi-use units, which I'm not a huge fan of, because it's like, I only want the AC to do one job, and that's to cool, and heat. I feel like when they throw all these units in that can do, dehumidification, like they've got all this stuff built into them, I feel like it's overcomplicating what needs to be done. I would rather someone have like a standalone commercial dehu, because what I've had a lot of people do, especially in condos now, it's becoming more regular as far as inspections go, but they're putting whole house dehumidification in and having a separate thermostat set for the humidity that they're trying to stay within. And that actually relieves a lot of stress off the AC, because now you're trying to control the humidity. Instead, with the AC, you have to pull the temperature down in order to remove the humidity. So therefore, you're making it colder and having to run a big AC unit cooling the house when you don't even need to cool it. You're just trying to remove the excessive humidity in the house. So a lot of landlords, especially when they have tenants that have issues with running the air conditioner like they should, I've actually had landlords that's put in commercial dehus and just have a thermostat set that the tenant doesn't really understand what it's even for, but it allows the house to stay balanced even if they run the air conditioner, because that way it'll at least keep the humidity within spec as far as that goes.
So what do those typically cost, those dehumidifiers?
I think the last time I heard installed, I want to say they were like 1,500 to 2 grand. So I mean, it's a little on the higher end, if you're talking about the lower side of housing. But the way I look at things is that I would rather be out the 2 grand than have a tenant that doesn't run the air conditioning and then have to gut bathrooms or gut a room or something like that if the mold got worse enough, or even the AC ducting and stuff, because it'll get trapped in there and grow in there as well. So
Wow. Yeah. So that cost that you just mentioned, is that just for the unit itself, and is it a standalone
it,
unit?
Yeah, it's a standalone unit. So it's typically, I say it's probably about the size, probably, I don't know, 2 foot long by a foot deep, foot tall. Like it looks almost like a large suitcase.
Okay.
Is our baggage, for traveling type. So, they've got different ways. They've actually got duct on each end, so you can actually either duct them into the actual unit ducting, like for the AC, or like the condos. What they're doing is they're putting them in the return. That way, the air is being pulled into the return through the filtration, and then they have a drain line like a typical AC to drain the condensate out.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. And what about let's just say that a landlord does not install a dehumidifier like that. What about installing some gauges that just throughout the house to inform the landlord of the humidity levels?
Yeah, you could do that. I think the one thing you would have to be careful with is that, obviously a lot of people live off of Amazon and things like that, and you would
Yeah.
just want to use a quality humidistat, or, relative humidity indicator, because some of those I've had customers that have bought like the 4 packs off Amazon and put them throughout the house. And when I go through with my relative humidity, I can hold it right beside, and some of them have been 4 or 5% off,
Right.
which I tell people, when you're ordering them cheap ones like that, I wouldn't necessarily worry about the actual number, but just trying to find what's comfortable. Because most of the time when you have a humidity problem inside of a house, like especially with oversized AC systems, things like that, the house will be cold, but when you walk in, it's like a really wet cold. It's almost like walking in a beer freezer or something like that at a gas station, because
Yep.
it's just really wet and cold like a refrigerator would be.
Right.
So that's usually, like I said, an indicator that an AC is either oversized or not pulling the humidity out. But yeah, I mean, they could put stuff throughout the house, but finding one that's like, oh, it's exactly 49% is going to be really hard, to really pinpoint. They really would have to use it more for reference, than anything.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, what is the interplay between you and HVAC guys? I mean, the HVAC guys are in charge of the AC unit. Maybe they put in the wrong unit, maybe they put in the wrong size unit. And then so you're looking at the unit and saying, "Hey, just doesn't seem to be the right unit for this." So how do you interplay with those guys?
So, and then this is where the home inspector side of me would come out in this. Now, obviously, we can read tonnage and BTU ratings and things like that. The one thing, as a home inspector, that we have to kind of be careful of is obviously getting into a disagreement as far as you know AC size and things like that. Is you've got so many high efficiency units now to where you can have a unit that can be a dual stage compressor, to where it can be a 2 ton, but it can also be a 4 ton depending on the demand. So, obviously those units are pretty obvious. I mean, they look like a spaceship when you look at them. I mean, they look ridiculous as far
Yeah,
as outsides go,
yeah,
but like your typical Ream Goodman, stuff like that. I mean, I've got a lot of AC guys that I work with, so I kind of have them again. It's like we're all in a circle, and it's like I like to educate each other and on different things, because technology is always changing. So there's always going to be a new standard that's going to be kind of expected, or uh, kind of makes things more efficient, where stuff that we may have done 15 years ago has changed a lot since now, especially for air conditioning, because now you got multi-speed fans, dual stage compressors, you got electrostatic zone systems throughout houses. I mean, things like that. The biggest thing is just looking at the tonnage, because the tonnage is what's important. So the general rule of thumb, even as a home inspector, we're trained roughly 500 to 600 square feet per ton. That's kind of an ideal number. Now,
gotcha.
give or take, that'll fluctuate a little bit, but like I tell people, as far as buying air conditioners, you're better off being a little bit undersized than oversized, because the undersized is going to run a little bit longer and be able to pull that excessive humidity out. Unlike a large unit may cool the house down really fast, but it'll short cycle. It may run for 10 minutes and drop 4 or 5 degrees, but it hasn't ran long enough to condensate and pull all that humidity out of the house.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's the issue I run into quite a bit.
Now, do you see a difference between, um, I guess, between the way older houses are built versus the way newer houses are built, or is there really not a difference in as it relates to mold problems?
So a big issue that I run into all the time, and I get the consumer side of things, because I have homeowners that tell me this all the time, is that, say they have a house built in 1965, it's got original AC ductwork in it, which was typical 6, 8 inch duct, like a little bitty stuff compared to what we have now.
Yeah.
But they'll have an AC company come in, and their system's, 25 years old, it's shot, they need to replace it. And then a good AC guy, which, I say this very loosely because some are salesmen, but, at the end of the day, they try to say, look, we're going to put this new unit in, but it's not going to be near efficient with this old ductwork. Well, the homeowner's first reaction typically, and they always tell me this because it's funny, is that they're just trying to sell me something.
Yeah.
I don't need that. Ductwork's been fine for 30 years, blah, blah, blah. Well, going back to the mold side of things, you would be shocked at how many jobs I go out to where they'll put these brand new multi-speed fan units in, and I've actually had them blow the plenum apart at the top because they're moving so much air that the original ductwork can't handle it. Because
Wow.
now it's based on demand. So if you turn down 1 degree, the fan speed may be 1, but if you turn down 3 degrees, it's going to kick up 2, 3, and 4, and it might force so much air through, it'll actually leak more than it's doing any good.
Wow.
So I usually tell people, like, if you got a house that's over 35 years old, I mean, your AC's quit and your ductwork's original, I mean, I know it sucks, but you're better off figuring out a way to do it all at once, because the efficiency you're going to get back out of it in a year or two is going to be well worth the money. Because then you're not going to have I come out and kind of put bandages to fix an old system, because by the time you pay for all that, you could have just replaced the ducting, over time.
Yeah. So I guess that strikes my mind in thinking that, if you have a situation where, like for example, the tenant saying, well, the house doesn't seem to be cooling enough, or maybe it's, the humidity levels are high. Maybe one of the things that an inspector has to do is to look to see if the ductwork is actually hasn't lost its integrity, or there's a problem.
And that's where I was going back to about, if you have just say a 1,500 square foot rental, and and you're going to put a new system back in, I would keep it simple. I mean, that, as far as being overly efficient about worrying about SEER rating, which, I mean, it's the higher SEER is always better. But again, you have to look at the house. If you've got a 1,500 square foot house and you're putting in a 2.5 ton, 3 ton unit, whatever, you don't want to overcomplicate something. I mean, it's an air conditioner. That's what it's going to do. So when you throw in another variable of having like a multi-speed fan or any of this, like these high efficiency Bosch units, things like that, like it's literally got one job. So it's like, I feel like keeping it simple and buying, either like a Goodman or a Ream or just a good mid-grade unit is going to save from having to worry about, high tech this and that as far as having to maintain it. Because obviously with rentals, I mean, every landlord, if they're telling the truth, they want low maintenance. That's what they want.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
overcomplicating some of them things can kind of cause more money than it's worth, having to deal with that.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's kind of jump into, once you do an inspection and it seems like you have some elevated fungus growing, is there a difference in your mind between, the types of fungus that could be growing? Like, is some more dangerous than others? Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, so mainly when we do an assessment, we always have a control sample, and that's one we take outside, that kind of shows us what's normal as far as ranges and types and things like that. So every day and every hour, that number is going to change. So we take kind of a snapshot at the moment, for the control. So that way we can compare at that moment when we're sampling what's inside the house, how much, all that. Now, as far as the types of growth, the one that is always going to jump to people's mind is going to be Stachybotrys, which has been labeled as black mold for ever since it's been known. I don't like seeing any of that on an interior sample. Now, there's circumstances where, if you have one spore on a sample, then, that wouldn't be overly concerning, but, I would at least want to know why, as far as looking more in depth as far as that goes. But I mean, there's thousands of different types of molds, but the ones I typically run into are like Aspergillus, Cladosporium, Chaetomium, and I mean, there's a plethora of them, but there's usually 12 to 13 of them, that produce mycotoxins, which is more common where people, usually have allergy issues and things like that. Not to go too far into the medical side, anytime someone has medical questions, I always suggest they contact their doctor, obviously, because I'm more there to assess as far as elevation goes instead of what they actually react to, because everybody's different as far as allergies go and things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. So I get, and yes, like you said, you're not able to address medical issues or that kind of thing, but I guess when you're looking at the house and you say, well, there's elevated levels for whatever the fungus is that you're dealing with, when do you sort of know that the situation is more serious and needs immediate attention versus, hey, we could do this, it's not what you would consider dangerous, and thus, something that you can plan for in the future?
So with that being said, what it really would boil down to for me on something like that is that if you have a lot of visible growth, like if you have a ton of visible growth, like I've had 2-story apartments where the bottom floor has sustained a lot of water damage because the second floor has either leaked over time or something like that. And there's just a plethora of growth on the entire ceiling throughout the unit. That would probably be a situation where I'd say, look, this needs to be addressed like now, like, because obviously the longer you wait with mold growth, if you do have a mold problem, those numbers can multiply 2 and 4 and 5 times over in a day's or 2 days time, depending on the type of growth. So obviously, anytime there's an elevation, I mean, it's always better than now rather than later. I mean, that's always the game plan. But I know with tenants, I mean, I've had some people that, I've had to reschedule them 4 or 5 times because they're just hard to get in and get out. So I can only imagine having to deal with something like that. But, that's a variable, unfortunately, you have to deal with sometimes on some of these jobs.
Right. So if you don't see growth throughout the house, okay, so let's say you're just looking at an isolated isolated spot in the house. Maybe it's the bathroom, maybe it's a closet, maybe it's just under the cabinets. In that scenario, I mean, is that when you look at that, what's the approach at that point?
So normally something like that. So with the state of Florida, if there's anything less than 10 square feet, it's not required to have to be remediated. So in a lot of situations like that, which I try to tell people, if you're going to do any type of things, it's always good to contact the actual remediator, because I mean, there's a lot of these guys that will give you free information as far as little areas of concern, like you said, like under a sink or something of that nature, to clean up effectively and not have to worry about it, because as long as it falls under that 10 square foot, you don't have to remediate it of any kind or even do any type of testing.
Gotcha. So how do you know when, if it's determined that you need to remediate in some way, how do you know when it's necessary for the tenant to move out of the house during that time?
So that would strictly be based on the remediator at that point, because they're going to have to bring in a lot of equipment. If they have to do demo, like that's where the inhabitability question kind of comes out of them, because there's some instances where if it's one room, they can just shift everything out of that room and then they can do their job. But then if they're talking about like an overall house clean, there's a lot of people that really don't want to deal with that, just because it's a lot of, putting all their contents either in a storage box, like in out front, or transporting it to their place to have it detailed, cleaned and everything before it's brought back into the house. So that's kind of a job per job basis. It's hard to always tell what's considered inhabitable, because we don't know what the extent the remediators are going to have to really take in order to do their job. Because you have some that have high standards and some that are like, oh yeah, we can clean it in place. But that's really based on the remediator at that point, if they're able to work around the homeowner or whoever's living in the house.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Whenever remediation is being done, do the remediators, let's just say it's in a limited area in the house, are they able to adequately sort of isolate that area while they're treating, remediating, or no?
Yeah, they are. They'll have a zipper door installed inside containment, and if they're they'll have air scrubbers running dehues and things like that. And of course, they typically will bag things up in 8 mil bags, and then they'll tie it up. They'll double knot it and tie it up and remove it from the house. A lot of times, if it's a lot of visible growth, they'll usually kind of treat it in place before they do demos, so that actually kills the growth. That way when they're bagging it up and removing it, there's not any concern of it. But with the equipment being ran, like I said, the air scrubbers and things like that, that's going to capture any particles that's being airborne when they're doing their demo. But a lot of times remediators try to, use things to their advantage, like a window or something like that, where if they can avoid from carrying it through the house, a lot of times they do. But as long as it's bagged properly and sealed, then, there's nothing to be concerned about.
Okay. So as you said earlier, landlords, the name of the game a lot of times is preventative maintenance, just making sure
Absolutely.
that problems don't happen. So I know that, when we're talking about fungus growing, I suppose that there may not always be some sort of early signs of determining that, I guess. But as far as like preventative maintenance, what would you say landlords should be doing to help at least give them some indications that, hey, there may be a problem and I need to take some action here?
So the most important things, like we stated before, is air conditioning. Like that's going to be your biggest fail safe, as far as, because, isolated water leaks, like, a kitchen sink, a bathroom sink, things like that, those are a little more isolated. But when you're talking about an air conditioner, just knowing what your tenant's keeping the temperature at, make sure it's functioning like it should, things like that. That's your first line of defense, controlling humidity in a house. So that to me would be put priority number one, just to make sure that's at the top of the game as far as what it can be. But as far as maintenance goes, I mean, I do have customers that they have me go out and do a mold sample, just one sample inside the house, like occasionally, annually, just for kind of a mental thing to kind of
Yeah.
know if there's something kind of festering up. Then we can say, okay, the humidity was a little high when I was there. I suggest, either getting dehumidification or running the AC a little bit more to try to prevent, anything from catching up. But and it goes back to the AC as well. Routine duct cleanings are not something I normally advocate for annually, just because, when you have a company come in and if they do it right, you shouldn't have to have a duct cleaning for another 5 to 10 years, in my opinion.
Oh, wow.
Because, if they're running good filters and change them like they should, I mean, you're going to have residual dust bypass those filters. There's nothing you can seal it up as tight as you want. It's still going to bypass. But like recently, I just had all my ducting replaced in my house. I have a 1990 build, and I had the guys come in and clean and encapsulate everything. And I just went ahead and replaced all my flex and everything, because being in this industry, I don't take any shortcuts, as far
Yeah.
as having to deal with later.
Right. Yeah, you know what the situation is there. What about, so you mentioned annual inspections, which I think is great. I don't, with the cost, I don't know what the cost is. Maybe you can share that with the audience here. But do you think that it's some, annual inspections, the way you're describing, is that something that you think every landlord should be doing?
I mean, I think it's ideal, just because, especially if they've had issues in the past, to try to help pinpoint, what could be causing an issue, or, maybe they don't have any faith in their tenant to really tell them the truth, or, take care of their place. I mean, it really just depends as far as cost. I mean, square footage is a big factor in that, because I have some landlords, they're like, well, I just want you to walk in there and take one sample in the living room or a bedroom or something like that. Or maybe they've had a tenant that's complained of a cough or something like that. They're just wanting to kind of nip something in the bud. But they usually range, $350 to $650 is pretty ideal, depending on the size of the house, because it's really based on how many samples we have to take.
You've given us a lot of information, Blake, and I greatly appreciate this. Is there anything that you would like to sort of leave with landlords to say, hey, this is my gold nugget I'm giving you for the day, or whatever you
Well,
want to say?
yeah, well, I mean, I can say this. I have, rentals as well, and the one comment that I always tell all my tenants that's ever rented from me is, I'm very adamant on communication. I mean, because I tell them all the time, if there's even a drip in this thing that goes wrong, like, I want you to call me directly. And I think that's a big issue I run into quite a bit, is that you've got someone who's got a lot of rentals that, especially if they're using a rental agency, to kind of handle the middleman stuff.
Yeah.
But I find so many issues to where something wasn't escalated properly, where it was kind of pushed off because they've got 100 other rentals to deal with. Um, I feel like what I tell my tenants is, I'm like, look, I understand there's stuff going to happen, stuff's going to break, that's just part of it. But I always tell them, I'm like, if you take care of me, I will make sure you're taken care of, because the way my mentality with rentals is if I had to up and leave my house now and go live in that house, like, that's the condition I want it to be in, because I want to be able to live in it.
Yeah.
And I think communication is probably one of the biggest downfalls in the rental agency and just rentals in general, because you got some people that do have hundreds of rentals and they can't contact and talk to every single renter. But I think that's what makes it harder for them, unlike the guys who only own, 5 or 10 or 15, because they're, but I feel like if you have that open communication, then it nips a lot in the bud as far as having to deal with stuff where it's been neglected, especially if you're talking about a leak that's this big and it goes on 3 years and now you have to replace all the kitchen cabinets in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which, that would have been way cheaper just to fix the leak, to begin with instead of having to tear the whole kitchen. So I think communication is the biggest thing that I can leave with people, is just to be up front. And even if there's any tenants watching this, like, I mean, I know there's been situations I've been in that's been, back and forth, but being open communication is one of the biggest things I run into, that if it would have been communicated early, all this could have been prevented, from
Yep.
escalating this far.
No, that's a great point to end on. And I represent a lot of property management companies, and one of the things I help them with is preparing some of their business documents, or lease documents. And one of them is put in writing, like, here's the process whenever you suspect
Absolutely.
mold, or you suspect a problem in the home. Is that communication? We have to know right away so we can address the problem sooner than later. It just helps everybody out. So having that, and then having open lines of communication, having a way for tenants to be able to report these things. If you're a professional company, chances are you're using some kind of an online portal system. And if you're an individual landlord who may, own a rental or two or three, probably using, email as a way of communicating a lot of times. But again, as you said, the phone is having a phone number for them to call, especially in emergencies, and just being able to report these things. And then for the landlord, having guys like you who they can call and say, hey, Blake, this is the problem. I need you to go out there. I need you to see what's going on. Someone they trust, someone who's professional, someone who's going to give them the information they need so they can make decisions, take action as necessary. So those things are critically important. And that is a great point to end on. So thanks for bringing that up, Blake.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're going to end the show for now. So I want to thank Blake again for joining us today. It's been a wealth of information. If you need to contact Blake, again, his website is inspectrealestate.com. And what is the business phone number for you?
It's 850-477-4680.
Okay. And where do you service in Florida?
I actually service the entire state of Florida, actually Alabama and Mississippi as well.
Oh, nice. All right. So for those in Alabama, Mississippi, and throughout the entire state of Florida, Blake can be a guy that you can rely on for these types of services. So this is great. I'll put this information in the notes in the podcast as well, Blake, so people, if they want to reach out to you, they can do that easily. So
awesome.
All right. Thanks, Blake, so much for your time. And everybody, thanks for watching the show. We'll see you on the next show.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.